I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings, and problems to solve. Days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments. And with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Neural, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Yvonne Bajela, is a partner at LocalGlobe, a VC firm. She is Audit and Risk Committee Chair at Innovate Finance and founding member at Impact X Capital Partners LLP, where she was formerly principal and she had exposure on the board of HarperVest Global Private Equity. Yvonne, a huge welcome and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start by talking about the value that a board can bring to startups? And I'd love to hear whether you can give me 3 examples, perhaps, where you've seen startup boards add material value to their organizations.
Absolutely. So I think the best boards provide a lot of strategic guidance. They're what I call partners rather than providing governance and oversight. And originally, when I started out being a board member, I thought it was very much about that oversight piece, but really it's about providing that strategic guidance along the way. I've had the privilege of being on quite a wide range of boards. As you mentioned, the HarperVest Global Private Equity Board, which is obviously a public listed business, startup boards, charitable board, and an industry body board in Innovate Finance. And drawing on those 3 particular examples, I guess one particular example, so I've had the privilege of sitting on quite a few fintech boards as an investor director. And in doing so, I was once on the board of an insurtech that was strategically looking for clarity during the scale-up phase, played quite a pivotal role in helping the founders really prioritize their focus, working really closely with them in terms of focusing on strategically aligning on, you want to know what the North Star is, because sometimes when things are growing and scaling really rapidly, you can lose sight of that as a CEO. It was really about providing that clarity during that period of accelerated growth while maintaining discipline. And what I learned during that process in particular was a board's real value is in helping founders really prioritize ruthlessly without losing the vision. If I'm to share another example, I've invested in quite a few companies across borders as well. Sat on the board of an African company, which has some element of fintech. And again, they were navigating hypergrowth. And oftentimes when you are scaling quite rapidly, governance can become something that gets left in the back seat, right? And so I think that's where the board has a very big role to play. The board really helped the leadership team professionalize their internal operations during that rapid scaling phase, from recruiting senior talent to implementing more rigorous risk compliance frameworks. The board support was really instrumental in maintaining momentum while building institutional strength. And I guess it was a real lesson in growth is fragile without governance when you get the right, when you get to a certain level of scale. I guess the third example I would share was when I was on the HarperVest Global Private Equity Board, where I was as an apprentice for a year. I think that board in particular was very instrumental in helping the company think through how to mitigate for risk in market volatility. Obviously, being a public market company, thinking through comms, risk mitigation strategies is front of mind. And that's a very specific example, given that it's a public company. But I think the best boards really anticipate what may come and start laying out the groundwork early.
Okay, there's 3 really interesting and quite different examples. Can we do a deeper dive on that fintech where you talked about aligning on that North Star and the role the board played there? Can you bring that to life for me?
Yeah, so I think that when companies are going through this rapid period of growth, I think it's just really important. And that's the really good role that board members can play in that helping founders zoom out from the here and now to the bigger picture of what they're actually trying to achieve, the broader vision. And so in that particular case, it was a matter of essentially spending time with the CEO to really think through the plan over the next 12 months, 24 months, what we really wanted to hone in on to achieve, and really figuring out what does great look like in those particular time periods, and then focusing on key metrics that we wanted to achieve within that period of time. Because oftentimes when things are growing very fast, you can really forget what the main things are. But you want to also make sure that the main thing remains the main thing, right? And so again, I think the board can play a really great role in helping founders prioritize the key things that are important without continuing to grow and scale and losing out on the broader vision.
So I remember that stage well, the early stage for us. And I remember all sorts of people being quite dogmatic in the frameworks that they would use and sort of insisting that we should have this one North Star that everyone was pushing towards. And they gave the examples of, Facebook, where they figured out that if they got whatever it was, people engaged for X number of months, then everything else followed from that. And maybe that was just our business, but it never quite worked. And it always felt a little bit artificial to me that there was never one metric, that there was always a constellation of metrics. And maybe there was one leading metric, but there would always be some hygiene factors that needed to be at least above a certain level, as well as some that we were pushing towards. And I always remember people pushing back heavily on, things like having revenue as a metric, which, as a bootstrapped entity actually was quite important, making sure you had enough cash coming in. So can you bring to example in that specific one, like what was the North Star you aligned on? Was it easy to get to? How did the board help the founders there identify that metric? Can you talk about it in a way that a board member listening to this, who's perhaps sitting on the board of an early stage startup and wanting to help them, might find instructive?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this case, as I mentioned, it was an insurtech company, right? And I think that with insurtech companies in particular, the loss ratio is one of the key metrics that you often look at. But then sometimes when you're really pushing with growth, that can impact the loss ratio. It's the loss ratio essentially being the level of losses that one will have. And so sometimes it's really challenging to have a North Star metric, especially where there's friction between those two metrics. And I think where the board really came in was saying, okay, this is how we're prioritizing that. Where we see risk, how can we mitigate those risks, but also ensure that the company is achieving underlying growth? Boards can lose focus when they're chasing metrics or narratives that don't match where the business is going. The company was experiencing strong levels of growth, but we also needed to ensure that everything wasn't breaking in the midst of that. Reestablishing overall priorities was really key, and ensuring that we're not over-indexing in terms of the burn, given where we see the next fundraising round, taking a more holistic approach to it rather than focus on that one core metric. Like you said, there's never really one metric, and I totally agree with you on that.
So just for those who aren't familiar with the insurance space, the loss ratio is the ratio of payouts on insurance claims to premiums received, what people who are insuring themselves pay to the business. So it sounds like that was the key metric that you were focused on. Is that right?
One of the key metrics, just given that, an insurer is assessed based on how they are able to manage risk. And ultimately, when you're growing so fast, there is a risk that you lose control of managing that loss ratio, right? And so it's about really managing the two in a sustainable way.
So for you, as the board there, I imagine the founders were chomping at the bit to just drive growth at all costs, and the value that you brought in there was to say, well, hang on, let's not build on a sort of on sand. If we just grow and we haven't actually got a sustainable business with a loss ratio that is economically sustainable, revenue is vanity and it's profit that's sanity, and cash flow that's reality. The board is.
Yeah, I guess it is to ensure that we're still growing at a very fast pace, but ensuring that growth is sustainable.
And so where was the misalignment on that? So it sound like you brought in the alignment as the board. How did you go about bringing that together? That, again, someone listening who might be in that situation where they've got the classic headstrong founder who's keen to charge on at all costs, just kind of making them see that bigger long-term picture.
Yeah, I think that's where having trust with the founders is really key. One of the things that I did in that particular scenario is have conversations one-on-one with the founding team to ensure that they understood the perspective of the investors around the table, but also understand what they're trying to achieve and essentially trying to find alignment between the two, because we're all in this together. We all wanted to achieve the same thing, but we just wanted to ensure that the growth wasn't being achieved at the cost of the overall risk of the business, right? And so I think just having that trust really does help. Spending time with the founders outside of board meetings, for example, is a really great way to do that.
So can we role play this? Where let's play, I'll be the headstrong founder, which might be a role that comes naturally, where I'm saying, Yvonne, we just got to grow at all costs, because once we hit scale, everything else will fall into place. And if we don't hit the scale, someone else is going to get there before us. What do you say to me as the founder?
I think I would say growth is really important here. Obviously, we want to really penetrate this market, but we also want to ensure that we are building a sustainable business. One of the key things that investors in the next round will look at is that loss ratio and ensuring that the growth is sustainable. How can we ensure that we're growing, but also managing the risk, which is the key downside here? Let's work through what we can do to ensure that we are mitigating that risk versus just focusing exclusively on the growth.
Tell me more about this African company, which was working across borders, navigating hypergrowth. And you alluded to the fact that sometimes in those situations, governance can get left in the backseat. I'm sure that will be a scenario familiar to lots of listeners who sit on the boards of earlier stage businesses. What was your approach there?
Yes, I think in that particular scenario, it was really just about ensuring that there was clearly gaps in the team as the company was growing and scaling from a risk and governance perspective, and bringing in individuals who had navigated companies at that sort of scale that they were entering into. And so I felt that we could really help the company at that particular moment in time is helping hire people with those skills to work internally with the company. And so that's really just going through, sometimes offsites are really valuable for these sort of scenarios where the company goes through, where's the next phase of the business going over the next, say, 12, 18, 24 months? Where are the gaps in the team? What do we need to do to fill them? What kind of skill sets are we looking for? And then board members can be brought in during that interview phase, for example.
What has been the 3 most challenging situations you faced as a board member?
Navigating co-founder breakups is definitely one of the scenarios that comes to mind. One of my portfolio companies, 2 co-founders, both deeply talented, essentially reached a bottleneck in terms of strategy, communication. The disagreement began affecting the team morale, external perception. I think that as board member, you're not there to pick sides. You're there to really protect the business, support the CEO making the hardest calls, right? In that particular scenario, I facilitated discussion with both the founders, supported the CEOs in structuring a graceful, respectful transition. And ultimately, strong governance, founder empathy, and swift decision-making is really key in these sort of scenarios when it comes to founder breakups or any sort of issues with the team in particular.
You say you're not there to pick sides. I've experienced that situation as a board member. And what I found quite challenging is when you do facilitate those discussions, often it can become quite clear what the answer is quite quickly. And that's fine if everyone around the table recognizes it. But when it becomes difficult is when one or more of the parties doesn't recognize the issue, especially if they are the issue. What do you do, and have you experienced that situation?
Yeah, so in one recent example, a company that I've invested in, essentially, one of the founders decided it was time for him to leave. He actually made the decision himself. But in leaving, he essentially said that he wanted to maintain his equity. And I think that from an investor point of view, maintaining such a high equity stake in any business that you're no longer part of can be detrimental to the company in the future. And so one of the conversations that had to be had with the founder is, yes, I understand your contribution, but this is no longer in the company's favor. And it's really just about helping the individual understand the implications of the decision that they were making. And yes, I think that particularly when it comes to anything to do with team, founders, it can get quite emotional, right? It involves emotions. People get quite sensitive about these issues. I think it's really just about trying to help the individuals understand the implications, essentially.
And I guess that's a particularly prevalent problem in early stage businesses where often the initial valuation is inflated based on anticipated value coming from the founder. And so when that founder then leaves, actually you need to bring it back to a more realistic expectation. What have you found helpful in navigating those discussions that board members listening might learn from?
I think you have to try and stay as impartial as you can. I think that naturally, as investors, as board members, you may have a stronger relationship with one party versus the other. I think it's just really important to remember that as board members, you are also representing the business, right? The shareholders. And so really trying to take a step back and leverage the views of those around you, outsiders as well, just to sometimes help you see from an outside perspective can be really valuable. Because I think sometimes boards can get groupthink, right? And so I think sometimes just seeking that external guidance can be quite helpful depending on the situation.
Yeah, you're making me think there of Simon Devlin, who was a guest in episode 105, where he talked about the science of halftime team talks, in which he had done a PhD. One of his insights was that players don't listen to the manager as much as they listen to other players. And actually, that's something I've seen at work in those situations where, as an investor, you can be saying something to a founder and they just don't listen to you. Whereas if you get a couple of other founders to come and say exactly what you were just saying in exactly the same words, suddenly they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense to me. And that outside perspective can unlock something. It's a little bit like this experience recently with my kids where I was trying to teach them something and I said something and they just didn't listen at all. And someone else came and said exactly the same thing and they did it. And I was like, hang on, that's what I said.
Yeah. I can so relate. I think particularly speaking from the perspective as an investor, oftentimes when you do get tough situations, it's always best to show and not tell. For example, if a founder's going through a tough situation, rather than just to speak to the issue, show how it could be done better. Or bring in others that have maybe walked the walk already and gone through that particular situation and can help them see the other side.
Got it. Any other ways in which you've helped unlock co-founders navigating a breakup? I mean, that, in my mind, is pretty terminal for an early stage business that you've invested in. Reid Hoffman has written a bit on this and, says that one of the mistakes board members who are not experienced in early stage startups make is they sometimes think their role is to hire and fire the CEO. And actually that's not really an option in an early stage business because it is the CEO, the founder of the business. And therefore you've got to work out not whether to fire them, how you enable them and create the environment for them to succeed. So just curious to hear if you've got any other tools in your box for navigating those situations that listeners might be able to use themselves.
Yeah, I think ultimately, when I think about particularly early stage teams, no CEO is able to do everything, which is why most companies will have a team. And I think it's just really important as board members to really identify where the gaps may be. And if a CEO has some blind spots, we should highlight them and help fill in those gaps, whether it's through coaching, for example, that's something that I tend to recommend to founders, or whether it's by bringing in advisors that could help navigate a particular blind spot. I think it's just really helpful to find ways in which you could help navigate that in particular, because like you said, the founder tends to be like the driving force of the vision. And so figuring out how they could best be supported, I think is a key role of any board.
So you talked about navigating founder breakups. That's a fairly challenging situation to face. What are the other most challenging situations you faced as a board member?
The change in market dynamics would be another one. So, during the 2022 market correction, one of my portfolio companies faced a down round. The founders are obviously understandably emotional. They built something meaningful and now they were dealing with shifting investor sentiment. And it hit markets very quickly because obviously prior to that, the market was booming. Rounds have been done at significantly higher valuations than any time before in history. I think in that particular situation, what we did as a board is really focus on transparency and narrative management. I think that's what matters the most than ever in moments of vulnerability. So we worked with the CEO to reframe the situation that, at the end of the day, when you raise a round, the valuation that you achieve is for that moment in time. And what's more important is having the funding to essentially keep the business going, right? And so really shifting that sentiment was really important. And at the end of the day, it was key to just ensure that we still got funding versus trying to achieve a high valuation at that particular moment in time when markets were becoming really frothy. So we aligned with the board, negotiated founder-friendly terms in that down round, and managed to secure a syndicate essentially to come in and do that round. And essentially what we did was ensure that we turned what could have been a moment of really hit morale into a moment of resilience. And they've now come out of that.
Conversations are changing fast. AI, geopolitics, climate, cyber. If you've ever felt slightly behind these topics, Neural Plus gives you personal expert support and tailored content to stay credible, contribute confidently, and open doors to more ambitious board opportunities. Visit plus.neural.com to learn more. What's the lesson for a board member or a founder listening to this, aside from that focus on transparency and managing the narrative? One of the common things that I hear board members say is, raise money when it's available, not when you need it. Any other lessons that you've taken as a board member to guard against that scenario of a rapid shift in market dynamics?
Yeah, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with, raise the money whenever it's available. I also I've seen scenarios where companies can have a lot of money in their bank and, they find ways to use it. So I think what I would say is, that particular scenario is, yes, there are moments. Most companies have faced down rounds. I mean, Facebook faced a down round, right? But it doesn't mean that's the end of the business. At the end of the day, you're in business to keep the business alive. And that's like the key thing. And so even in those moments where it does get challenging and access to capital does become a lot scarcer, ultimately just ensuring that you're able to continue with that capital, still securing that capital, is really key. But then I think the other lesson is that, I think looking back at 2022, before 2022, it was kind of the era of grow at all cost, right? And I think now we've obviously moved into a market where there's never been a cheaper time to build a business, particularly with the advancements in AI. And so every company should be thinking about ways in which they can operate more efficiently, essentially. And I think that's the key lesson that every CEO should really take. I think you probably would have seen the announcement recently made by Shopify where they said, they're not going to hire for any roles unless they can prove that it cannot be done with AI. And I think that mindset is really key, driving efficiencies where you can. And obviously that shouldn't be done at the cost of growth. Like if a company's growing, then yes, you put in the resources that are required, but at the same time, just ensuring that if there are ways in which you can achieve efficiency gains, then I think that's just prudent to do. And that's a key lesson from that particular scenario. You just never know what's going to happen, right?
It's interesting. I've just been having a discussion around that. My sort of reaction to that memo is it strikes me that they run the risk of falling into that trap that to the person with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. We spend so much focus as a sort of product-oriented organization on really understanding the problems. And then AI is just one of a number of solutions that could be the solution to that problem. And you need to make sure there's enough awareness across the organization of what AI can do. But if you lead with AI, I really worry you end up with, as I say, like the person with the hammer.
Yeah, I agree with you to an extent, but I think that where efficiencies can be made, I think it's worth exploring it. And maybe a particular task activity can be replaced with AI. Maybe it cannot, but I think it's just worth at least having that view and perspective on whether things can be improved. And even if you choose not to do it, that's fine. But I think at least having an understanding of, what tools, products are out there, I think it is a smart move to make.
So can I challenge that? And I guess my response to that as a CEO at least would be, well, yeah, of course we'll find gains with AI if we look at everything through an AI lens, but it might not be my limiting factor. Like the thing I would most want to figure out is what is the limiting factor that is holding back our growth. And I want to be working on the next limiting factor every time, Whereas if I go and focus on AI, I'll find a whole load of things that might move the needle. And one of them might be the limiting factor. But doesn't it make more sense to come through that limiting factor lens rather than the solution lens?
No, I actually agree with you on that. I think the point that I was really trying to make is the fact that every organization should be aware of the tools that are out there, and a decision has to be made whether you fully embrace that or not. But I think just having a view, and in some organizations, we've seen that, one individual or a team of individuals are responsible for essentially assessing whether, AI tools make sense for a particular organization, for particular functions, for particular activities. And I think it's just helpful to have that view, just given how quickly everything's moving. Not every company is going to embrace everything, and that's fine. But in this fast-moving environment, it just helps to at least have a pulse on what's going on.
What approach do you encourage your organizations to take to that problem? Because it strikes me you've got two options as an organization. You can try to figure out who are your early adopters, who are your most sort of naturally leaning into AI, and give them more resource, more time, concentrate on it, and then look to spread out from them as sort of thought leaders in the organization. Do you have a view on what works best that you're seeing across your portfolio?
No, I think it ultimately depends on the nature of the company, what they're building. And some companies are going to be AI first, some companies are not. And it really just comes down to what's best for the business in that moment of time. There are companies where they've outright said, we don't see any value in focusing on AI at this particular moment in time. And that's fine if they've at least taken a view on it and they've assessed whether it makes sense for their business. But ultimately, what I think is really important is at least for there to be a view rather than completely dismissing the use of AI.
Okay. Now, you've talked about market dynamic changes as being a key challenge you face as a board member. In the financial, I guess another is in the sort of the fundamentals in the market. I guess that we're seeing a lot, or like I've seen a lot recently, of companies that have started as sort of companies piggybacking on the back of, say, an LLM, GPT or Claude or whatever it is. And then in the next iteration of GPT does exactly what they built and their business is dead, which strikes me as a failure of clarity of vision at the board level, that they haven't been clear enough around what their strategic moat is and how they will maintain a point of difference as, the LLMs evolve. Curious to hear how you're thinking about that right now with that market moving so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally right. I mean, a lot of the LLMs now are trying to build that sort of layer on top, essentially, to provide these additional services. And so one of the questions that I'm constantly asking is, when I'm looking at AI companies, is one of the research labs essentially going to come out with this? And so really having an understanding of what the moat is and where the real value lies is really key. And I think these are conversations that every board should be having, and ensuring that every CEO is able to clearly have a pulse on what the moat is and have a level of confidence around what the differentiation is. Because even if, I don't know, if it's a fintech cap model, for example, let's say OpenAI says they're going to come out with some sort of fintech agent, does that mean that, that's going to completely wipe out their business? Maybe not. Because as long as there is some moat there, and sometimes that's providing like the contextual aspects of the problem that they're trying to solve for.
In episode 53, we had one of my favorite authors, Hamilton Helmer, the author of Seven Powers, talking about the moats that tech businesses can create. Are there heuristics you use when looking at some of these AI businesses to quickly help you understand whether or not a moat is there that a board member or founder listening to this might be able to use when thinking about their own businesses?
Yeah, so a lot of the investments I make are within the technology space, right? In the past, technology was a moat. Technology is no longer a moat. The other day, I was on Twitter, or X as we now call it, and there was a founder that had essentially spun up a replica of LinkedIn. I think what's really key is distribution as a moat. How do you actually get this to the end customer? One thing that's really key. And then going beyond distribution, thinking through the broader vision of what the company is trying to achieve. And how you can continue to serve the customer segment in different ways beyond the initial entry point, right? So oftentimes when we speak to founders that are working on one particular area initially, they have a much broader vision of how they want to solve for the problem they're solving for. And this could be different verticals, for example. It could be going into new markets, but having a good picture in terms of where does this business go from here, where we are today, to really becoming this sort of generational business. I think it's really important to zoom out and really think about the bigger picture, because oftentimes I think businesses can get caught within the day-to-day weeds of building for today and zooming out. And I think that's where board members can also play a really great role in helping founders, CEOs really zoom out from their day-to-day. And for us as an organization, we focus very much on the teams and them having this unique insight, because oftentimes when we're looking to invest in a company, it's probably 5 other companies that are building the same thing. But what is it that makes that particular team unique, well-positioned to win in this space? And oftentimes it's that really unique insight on the problem that others don't have, or that broader vision.
Can we move on to talk a little bit about startup board hiring and composition?
Yeah.
For a founder listening to this, how do they know when is the right time to have a board?
I think it really depends on the nature of the company and the founder. I mean, we don't always recommend creating boards at that very early stage, because I think you almost want to strike the balance between having too much governance, if I dare to say, but also ensuring that, particularly in that early phase where, figuring things out, things are moving fast, ensuring that you're able to move at a pace that is required of you. What we try to do is milestone meetings where every quarter we come together with our founders and really discuss strategic priorities that are front of mind. Essentially, it's like a board meeting, but when I think about board meetings, I think of them as like reporting and covering all areas of the business. But I think particularly in those earlier stages, you kind of want to focus more on those strategic priorities. I think what's different though is particularly for fintech companies or companies operating in regulated spaces, having a board sooner rather than later can be of significant value. I often tend to see second-time founders creating boards a lot earlier for that accountability and also just to help them navigate any blind spots they may have. But yeah, I think there's no harm in creating a board early, but you just want to ensure that if you do have a board quite early in your journey, that it's additive.
What do they know that first-time founders don't?
Yeah, I think it's essentially for that accountability and being very strategic around who they bring around the table on boards. And I think something that doesn't get done as early as I think it should is bringing on board independent board members. Because I think that if you bring on board the right independent board members, they could add so much value. Oftentimes what you see, particularly at that early stage, is just all investors around the table. And obviously I think that can come with a lot of value, but sometimes bringing in independents where they may have deep industry expertise or bring something else to the table can be, of significant value.
Regular listeners will have heard me talking lots about the example of Nick Jenkins, the founder of Moonpig, in episode 95, where he talked about a couple of moments where his independents asked a couple of transformational questions. So one was, why can we not sell these cards for $2.99 rather than $1.99, which transformed the economics? And then the second question was around, why do we only doing cards? Why are we not doing flowers and cuddly toys? And he's like, because we're a card business. And then when he reflected on it, he thought, well, why not? And now that's sort of, 2/3 of the revenue. What are the moments where you've seen independent directors really add transformational value?
Yeah, so
are there any that stand out?
I think the best independents really know how to listen deeply, ask the unasked questions, and bring calm during moments of chaos. I think one in particular that has really stood out for me is, how the CEOs can be coached behind the scenes and offered support privately while the exec team are supported publicly. They weren't just experts, they were essentially enablers of confidence and clarity. And if I have to think of one example in particular, it would be Lou Smith on the board of Innovate Finance. I think she does a really great job of really encouraging the CEO, really playing that role behind the scenes. And she has a really great way of ensuring that she brings clarity and that confidence every step of the way, even in moments of chaos.
You talked earlier about being wary of too much governance. And when I hear people say that, I think the way I tend to read that is They're thinking about around the conformance role of the board, which often they see as a box-ticking role, as opposed to governance in its broader sense, which is about making sure the organization is well run. And so what I took from you there is if the board's role is essentially around strategy, talent, risk, and performance, you're saying in those earlier stages, you're really zooming in most on the strategy side of things and downweighting the other sides of it.
If I think back to some of the boards I've been on that are not really performing well, it's really those boards that become more about reporting more so than decision making. And so if a founder is like dreading a board meeting, then that's definitely a red flag in terms of like the value that they're getting from the board meeting. And, you know, you want to ensure that every board meeting is additive, right? And so I think that's where ensuring that and I do believe, you know, founders can really steer the ship in terms of how board meetings are conducted. But I think ultimately when I speak to over governance, I think it's really just spending more time on reporting rather than discussing some of the strategic priorities, which should be really key. So some of the best boards that I'm on, they tend to send the reports before the board meeting, assume they're read, we'll have a brief conversation on it, but then the majority of the conversation is focused on strategic priorities.
And when you say the majority of the discussion is on strategic priorities, is it debating what they are or debating between different options?
Yeah, so it could be debating through different options. It could be discussing what direction the company's taking and just getting input from various members of the board. I think ultimately a good board should really feel like a strategic ally and not an obstacle. I personally do believe that if a board meeting is just reporting rather than decision making, then something's off.
So that echoes something William Reeve, the founder of Love Film, once told me, which is your board should be your highest return on time invested as a CEO in any given period. If it's not, you need to fix it. And I've always sort of held that up as the sort of the benchmark that founders, CEOs should set themselves. But it can be quite difficult to change as a founder, CEO. What's your advice to someone who's sitting there listening to you now going, well, actually, we're in that reporting mode and we're not forward looking and we're not spending that time on the strategy. How do you go about changing that?
Yeah, I was actually on a board that was in that scenario essentially where it did become a lot about reporting. And one thing that the CEO did essentially went round to every single board member and just said, you know, what's strategically front of mind for you every quarter when we're having these meetings? And from that, he came to realize that, yes, they did want the reporting and like detailed overview on how the business was performing, as most investors or board members do want. But actually, they did want to have the strategic conversations, but they just wanted to find a way in which that could be done, the reporting, in a way that didn't mean that it was eaten in too much into the strategic reporting time, the strategic discussion time. And so what he did is, you know, he started sending the reporting prior to the meeting, setting out the expectation that, you know, in this meeting, we will have the assumption that everyone has read this. Come with any questions you have. The remainder of the time, I want to focus on X, Y, and Z. And so I think it's just about being very proactive and really steering conversation, essentially.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of having asynchronous exchanges, having, you know, Google Docs or whatever that you jot your thoughts down and everyone can put their comments on ahead of time and you can weed out certain questions that are simply sort of factual answers and then have the time to really spend on the conversation when you're in person. But the question, I suppose, is it fair and reasonable to expect the CEO to manage the board like that? And to my mind, I've always thought actually you need a chair to manage the board. And it's so blooming difficult being an early stage founder CEO, trying to manage a board on top, especially if you've got multiple investors on it, is a killer and an impossible ask. You know, have founders in tears on the phone to me saying, what do I do? That I'm spending all my time dealing with this board and the business is drifting off into the distance.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that would be in the absence of a chair, but you're absolutely right in saying that it should really be the duty of the chair. And that's where I think that, you know, I shared the example of the Innovate Finance Board where the chair, Lou Smith, plays such a great role in terms of really steering the ship in terms of how the meeting should go. But in doing that, she has such a close relationship with the CEO to ensure that they're aligned and, you know, everyone is getting the best out of the meeting. And so I think that, you know, where a CEO does have a chair, really ensuring that, you have that sort of chemistry and relationship with the chair to ensure that if something's not working for you, if the board meetings are no longer of value, have that conversation with the chair and figure out how best it can be restructured in a way that is additive. Because essentially you don't want to be coming to meetings every quarter or however often it may be when you're not getting much value out of it and it's becoming a reporting engine or, an aspect of it is not working for you. Because this is time, and time is very scarce when you're building a startup or running an organization essentially. And so ensuring that every second that you use is of value is really key.
It was an interesting article by Reid Hoffman on building startup boards where, he, in his mind, one of your responsibilities as a board member is to contribute to the dynamics of the board, and you shouldn't just leave it to the chair. What I hear of often in early stage companies where you've got multiple investors being dysfunctional and pulling in different directions because they've got different investor hats on rather than their independent director hats on. What's your approach in that situation?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the trust between the board and the founding team. I think sometimes you can get in situations where there isn't that trust. That's why I think one thing I really recommend is for CEOs to have dialogue with board members outside of board meetings, and that could be a monthly call. That's something that I find works really well, keeps them up to speed, ensures that any misalignment is discussed in that setting as well. So highly recommend that in terms of ensuring that there is a more positive dynamic amongst the broader board members.
Before we go on to the lightning round, I just want to quickly get your take on how you see your role as an investor director.
I think my role is to be a thought partner. It's not about being a gatekeeper. So I aim to support founders in making bold yet informed decisions while also ensuring that they're building something that's resilient, durable. It's about offering perspective and asking the hard questions, and sometimes being the person who reminds the team of the long game when things get noisy as well. I think one value that investor directors really bring is pattern recognition across multiple companies that we've seen. So as an investor director, you're exposed to a wide range of operating models, founder styles, market dynamics. That breadth gives you the ability to spot inflection points, potential pitfalls a lot faster. It also means that you have a more nuanced and balancing strategic ambition and operational reality. And so I would definitely say that's the angle that I bring to the table.
I hear some founders eye roll when they hear investor directors talking about pattern recognition. What's an example of pattern recognition you spotted that has helped unlock an organization?
Yeah, a recent example actually is a founder that I work with. One of her co-founders was essentially leaving the business and she was really worried about how she navigated it. And, I said, it's all going to be fine. You've got this. Don't worry. We're going to navigate this period. And she said to me, why are you so calm? And I said, because I've seen it before. I've seen it many times. So I think that's an example of, where you do have a portfolio, you see certain milestones, inflection points, moments of chaos happen. You've seen it happen before. You've seen how founders have navigated what they've done well, what they haven't done well. And that's wisdom that you can share with other founders.
Yvonne, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Go for it.
Best book every board member should read and why?
I would say The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. I hope I'm saying it right. It highlights the human side of boardrooms, essentially, about the board dynamics and the importance of trust, constructive conflict.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Performative posturing, when people speak to signal authority rather than contribute value. I think it undermines real dialogue.
Most valuable board ritual?
Founder-only sessions at the start or end of every board meeting. Again, I think it just builds trust, clarity, and alignment in both directions.
Favorite quote?
Strong opinions loosely held. I think it captures the importance of conviction without ego. I think it's critical in both investing and governance.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Wait your turn. I think impact doesn't follow a timeline. If you're ready, set up.
What's one assumption people make about racial diversity in the boardroom that you'd challenge?
I would say that diversity is a nice to have or a PR strategy. I think it's a strategic advantage, and diverse boards have been shown to spot risk and opportunities that others miss. And so I think they're highly additive.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I used to think that boards are primarily about oversight. I now think that the best ones are really thought partners, and they don't just protect value, they create it as well.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I would say I've learned to listen deeply, speak with more precision. Sometimes the most powerful contributions are the right question, not the right answer. And so, just being a listener, essentially.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
I would say great boards are built, not born. And so the most effective boards don't happen by accident. The other thing I would say is the role of investor director is to be a partner, not a protector. And so it's about more than just governance. It's really about showing up with empathy, context, and the ability to ask the hard questions. And then finally, to a point that I made earlier, just around diversity, I think it's a moral imperative. It's not a strategic one. And different lived experiences lead to different questions being asked, better debate, and ultimately better decisions being made.
Yvonne, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you.
If you want to stay ahead of fast-moving board conversations, with expert support guiding your development, Neural Plus can help. As a listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.neural.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.